This right here is a K through 12 picture frame, and over the course of just 4 months in 2023, this type of product pretty much single-handedly took our laser business from a few $100s a month to over $6,000 a month in revenue, earning us the coveted Etsy bestseller badge for the first time. And since that first frame sale, our shop has made over $46,000 total, with $31,345 of that coming specifically from this type of picture frame. Up to this point, I've kept this product a secret because frankly, I was making pretty good money from it, but now I'm ready to tell the full story. And I know how much I would have loved to see an inside look at a successful product like this when we were trying to get our laser business off the ground, because let's be honest, as new laser business owners, it can be pretty tough to find a product that actually sells. So here's what we're gonna do. Through the magic of YouTube, we're going to build one of these frames together from scratch, and this specific one is actually shipping out to a customer tomorrow. While we build, I'll tell you the story of this product, as well as the 5 biggest laser and business lessons that it's taught me. Towards the end of the video, I'll also do a breakdown of the profit that we make per frame, and I'll explain how we've changed our approach to our Etsy shop due to a couple of unique opportunities. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is related to one of the biggest challenges of starting up a laser business, which is just knowing whether or not what you have is actually going to sell. And I gotta say, I was really confident that these picture frames were going to sell. In fact, I was probably overconfident considering up to this point, the other products we had launched hadn't sold super well. But there were 3 main signs that showed me and my wife, who runs the business with me, that these picture frames were different. Number 1, there were multiple listings with bestseller badges, which is a sure sign that there is demand and order volume behind those listings. Number 2, the competition was low. It's gone up since we originally got into the market, but at the time there were 2 to 3 market leaders playing in this space with an additional 3 to 5 less optimized competitors. And at the time, the market leader in the space had a 4.8 out of 5 star rating, which if you're not familiar with the platform is actually kind of low. And so we thought we also had an opportunity to differentiate on product quality, consistency, as well as customer service. Third, and very importantly, there were clear opportunities to improve upon the existing listings. One of the key areas we focused on improving for our product was the design, particularly the font choices, which for a product like this are way more important than you might think. Just take a look at how the fonts in our Lightburn design here on the left compares with Lightburn's default fonts, which you can see here on the right. There's a pretty big difference between the two, and I think you'll agree that the one on the left just looks a lot nicer and better put together, and this is just a simple example of how big a difference carefully choosing your fonts can make when it comes to the aesthetic and look of your overall design. And if dialing in your laser settings happens to be one of those things that you struggle with, then you might want to go download my Lightburn starter kit, which is basically a collection of 5 custom test grids that I've put together to help with this. You can get it for free on my website by going to chalkwatts.com when you join my email newsletter. It'll email you the downloadable files and also a link to a video that kind of walks through and explains each of those tests. Now, to get these frames to actually stand out in the market so that we could get sales, we also made some intentional choices when it came to the color and layout of the frames. But that actually brings me to lesson number 2, which is how eliminating steps actually improved our overall design. One of the first things you'll notice if you look at the other listings on Etsy even today is that the majority of the products available are artificially colored, for example, with wood stain. So what somebody would typically do is take a light colored wood, probably Baltic birch, and then stain it with any assortment of stains that you can get from the local hardware store or Lowe's. And that's an easy way to offer a lot of colors while only having to stock one type of wood, but there is a significant catch, and that is that stained wood, at least in my opinion, cannot look as good as natural wood grain, especially when we're talking about a high quality hardwood like maple or white oak, which is what we're working on in this project, or something like walnut, which is why we decided to use those types of natural finishes for our frames. And I'm obviously biased, but I think you'd agree if you compared our products with some of the other options on Etsy that ours look a bit more premium because of that natural wood grain. And yes, this wood does cost a bit more, but remember, we're also saving a step by not having to stain. So all things considered, I'm glad we took this approach. The next lesson I learned actually came directly from customers reaching out and asking if we could make specific changes to the frames. In fact, the frame we're making today is a custom frame made directly for a customer who wanted an oversized version that's much larger than our standard frame size that you can see an example of here. In the early days, since we were pretty much just trying to gain some traction and earn some market share, we pretty much always said yes to these type of custom requests, and many of those new variations became their own listings. Now let's take a look at a real example of this to hopefully make things more clear. So what you see here is our original design, and that has photo slots from pre-K all the way to graduation. But we had a customer reach out and ask, hey, instead of by grade, could you basically do it by age? And so that what they wanted was something more like this design, which was newborn all the way to 18. And this design is even more different than what the competitors in the space were doing. And so this basically went on to become its own variation and its own listing. But the really cool part about this is that we never would have thought of this had the customer not reached out and asked. And this went on to sell pretty well for us, even when we were charging higher prices compared to the competitors. And after responding to this sort of request over several months, we ended up with a pretty sizable range of different frame styles, which gave us even more ways to stand out and get sales. That brings me to lesson number 4, which is the single most important thing that determines whether a listing on an online marketplace like Etsy stands out and gets sales or gets lost in the mix. But to really get a sense for how big a deal this actually is, it's time for a little game I call Good Photo, Bad Photo. So you can see here on the left, we have a pretty bad photo, and we see here on the right, we have a staged, nicely lit photo. Now, which one of these two are you gonna buy if you're on Etsy looking for something like this? Well, if you're like most Etsy customers, you're going to choose the one on the right, all things else being equal. But even if this one on the right was a little bit more expensive, even though it is the exact same product, a lot of the customers are going to buy this one simply because it looks better. But that's not all, because subconsciously, having those nicer quality pictures also implies something to the customer about your shop. So it might suggest in the mind of the customer that you have better quality control, better attention to detail. You get the idea. And to be honest, this little example doesn't even come close to doing this topic justice, because the shops that have higher quality photos not only sell more, but they can often charge higher prices. And it doesn't take a mathematician to figure out that if you're selling more at higher prices, then you're probably going to be doing pretty well. And speaking of the money, I originally made all of these picture frames on a 20-watt diode laser, which just goes to show that you really can get started with an affordable laser. But something I ran into when I started doing 20 to 25 of these things a week is that I always had a bit of scorching. And since I care about quality, I always sanded everything down and dusted it off before assembling, despite the fact that the plywood panels that I buy already have a pretty smooth finish when I get them. And eventually I did a bit of math and found out that about 30% of my hands-on labor time was just going to that sanding process. And as a result, I got a bit obsessed with eliminating scorching. And if you've been around my channel a while, you might know that I still have that obsession. But after a ton of side-by-side testing, I eventually figured out what I now call the 4 ingredients to perfect cuts and engravings. And one of those 4 ingredients is dialing in your power and speed settings. So if that is something that you need help with, just a reminder that you can get my Lightburn starter kit. I'll put a link to that in the description if you want to check it out. But long story short, I was able to ultimately dial in all 4 of my 4 ingredients to perfect cuts and engravings, such that each project either didn't need any sanding at all or only needed some spot sanding in a few places. This saved me a ton of time, which also means my hourly rate on making these went up. And to this day, I think this was one of the highest leverage things I've ever learned about laser engraving, but even this is just one example of the types of things you can do to gain efficiency and improve profitability as a result. And speaking of which, now is probably a good time to talk more about the numbers. And now it's time for everybody's favorite part of any YouTube video, which is to do some math. So what I've done here is I've basically drawn our expenses up on the chalkboard, and we'll go through it line by line so that you can get a sense for what the actual profit numbers look like on an oversized frame like the one we've been building out in this video. So the first thing we're going to see is the price. So the price for this item, again, it's one of those oversized versions, is $160. Then the largest expense by a good margin is materials, which comes out to about $39. But I should mention that this bakes in a 20% buffer for if we damage any materials or have any issues like that if we were to do this again. So there is some wiggle room baked into that materials number already. Our next largest expense is shipping and packaging, which comes out to about $20. And then next up after that, we have our Etsy fees, which is about 16 bucks. And then we also have machine time and electricity, which for us is not as high as you might think. And that comes out to about $1 for this item. So then if you run the numbers, we come up with a profit on this item of about $84. But this is yet to incorporate something that's really important, which is labor cost. And if we were trying to grow like a large scale laser operation, like a sign shop or something like that, we would probably have a separate line item up here for labor. But since we have what I would basically call a mom and pop laser operation going, we do something that's quite a bit simpler, which is basically just to add up the time that my wife and I spend collectively between the two of us on a particular item. And that includes things like communicating with customers, doing design work, running the project, packing and shipping. It's basically all in. And then we just use that to give ourselves an hourly rate. And so for this particular oversized frame item, all in, it took us about an hour
0.795, so about an hour and 45 minutes. And this gives us an hourly rate of about $48 per hour. And to us in our little laser operation we have going on here, this is a really solid hourly rate, especially considering that we can do this on our own schedule from our garage. But for anybody who's looking to do something like this, there are two things that I think are worth knowing about these numbers. The first is that on these oversized frames, we tend to make a little bit more profit. And so if we were to do a standard size frame right now instead, we would probably make something more in the ballpark of $45 per hour. And the second thing I want to point out is this is basically what we would make on a frame today. But in the early days especially, we made a lot less, and in fact, we probably lost money on the first several frames that we made because we were figuring things out, we were making mistakes and ruining materials, and we were also making samples for listing photos. And so it took us a while to get to this type of number. But at the beginning of this video, I also promised that I would explain how we've changed our approach to our Etsy shop based on a few unique opportunities that have come our way. So let's get into that now. Let's start by rewinding a bit. We sold our first picture frame in June of 2023, and this helped us hit our very first 1K revenue month on Etsy. And then just 1 month later in July, we hit our very first 5K revenue month. And then by September, we were doing over 6K revenue per month, driven almost entirely by these picture frame sales. But then in October, which was our biggest sales month up to that point, something came up. And not to be too dramatic, but it kind of changed everything for us. We'd been living in a rental home inside of a tiny little neighborhood that we had grown to really love, and we wanted to raise our young kids in this neighborhood. But the problem was that the rental home that we were staying in was pretty small, and we'd been looking to buy a new house to accommodate our laser business and also our growing family. But houses in this particular neighborhood rarely go on sale, and even when they do, it's quite competitive. So when a house that we liked actually did come on the market, when we bid on it, we were not really that surprised to find out that we got outbid. But then something really crazy happened, which was that deal fell through. We went back to the seller, and then we got outbid again, but then that deal fell through. And ultimately in that October, we were able to buy this house for actually less than our original offer, which was a pretty good deal. And as far as we can tell, the other deals that came before us fell through because the house was basically not move-in ready. It was a fixer-upper, and we knew that going in. But after thinking really hard about this, we decided that the financially prudent thing to do would actually be to close down new orders on our Etsy shop while I did or managed the renovations myself. And you can see in our Etsy graph that orders dropped way down starting in November as a result. But in hindsight, it's clear to me that we made the right call because we did tons of renovations and we saved tens of thousands of dollars over what we would have paid to hire that out. And so all things considered, we came out ahead in what we saved compared to what we would have made on Etsy. So after all this, we moved into the house at the end of January. But then we also had an additional unexpected opportunity that we had to consider. This YouTube channel that you're watching right now was something that I had basically published a few videos to here and there as I had time between Etsy stuff. And by early 2024, it had started to take off way more than I ever expected it to. But before we get too excited here, making money on YouTube is not nearly as easy as you might think, and our Etsy shop had definitely been making more money than my YouTube channel, especially up to this point. However, the views were starting to come in, and also really importantly, I was starting to hear directly from people in the YouTube comments and through my email newsletter who were in the community already, and it just started to seem like this was one of those rare opportunities to start building something really special, especially for somebody like me who just has always enjoyed explaining things. So my wife and I talked it over, and we made the potentially risky decision to shift our focus into Chalkwatts and specifically making better YouTube videos. Hopefully, I guess you'll be the judge of that, and also the laser engraving courses that I now offer. We still reopened our Etsy shop, but now we intentionally limit our orders and make a few $100 a month, selling mostly pet memorials and also a few frames like this one that is now ready to ship. So that's the full story, and that's also why you're now seeing a lot more videos from me. Speaking of which, if you like this particular style of video, feel free to let me know that in the comments because this was a new little experiment I was trying out with this format. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye now.